different ways that trauma shows up in various cultures around the world. So I started to notice these different trends. And what was really interesting as I went on and on in this work is that perhaps while the stories and their manifestations were different through the different cultures, what was shared were these really deep human experiences and organizing principles and emotions that ended up changing the way we perceive, relate, and express in the world. So while in tonight's session, I'm not going to go specifically into any one culture, I'm going to share, I guess, some philosophies and some of these key things that I see bridging across all different cultures. And I invite you, wherever you are, to see what it's like to allow them to refract through you and to see how they connect into your experience and the culture where you are. And I'm really curious to hear your questions, your feedback, your reflections, your counterpoint. As always, these sessions are made by us together. It's a collaboration. And so I really encourage you to keep putting your questions and reflections in the different chat boxes, and I'll be pausing along the way to see if I can respond the best way I can to some of them. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll keep them and we'll use them for future content and discussion. So thank you in advance for your engagement. So now that there's a few of us online over the various platforms, let's get started. And we're going to actually begin tonight's session a different way to usual. We're going to begin with a poem. And wherever you are in your corner of the world, if it feels safe and appropriate to you, I invite you to consider what it's like to close your eyes or adopt a downward gaze to listen and tune into these words. This poem is called Time Travelers. We are all time travelers, carrying the past in the present, weaving futures from our grandmother's baskets, whether they were empty or laden. Russian dolls, many mothers hidden inside us, children too, an endless unfolding of kin. We walk with their pain, we walk with their gifts, so often forgotten amidst modern world din. Our ancestors call, yet we cannot hear. Our grandchildren still stars in the sky. They beckon us to peer forward, to look back, to stand still, to rake the soil beneath our feet, discard the muck, plant new seeds, dance, pray, and bless our crops. Farmers of the future, our hearts beat through the ages, drumming away our pain, wisdom shared through rhythm, time travelers remembering. So just take a moment and perhaps a breath to allow those words, that poem, that art to refract through you and allow it to evoke or inspire whatever it may. And when you're ready, you can just potentially open your eyes, look around the space you're in, and connect back into this session. Thank you. Welcome to Intergenerational Trauma in Cultural Context. During today's session, we're going to be exploring the concept of intergenerational trauma, how it decontextualises through personality, dynamics, and cultures, and some of the core intergenerational trauma triggers and experiences. We're also going to explore in brief the road to healing, which as always is in the root. And in this case, the root is the wisdom of our ancestors. Now, before we get into it, I always think it's really important to connect to a shared definition for any topic we're going to explore. So I'm going to share with you my definition of trauma and also my understanding or definition of intergenerational trauma. Trauma is when a past experience of threat that's over is living and breathing in us now. It can affect us mentally, emotionally, physically, and relationally, and also socially. It shows up as sensations, emotions, and relating patterns, and it travels through relationships, families, cultures, and systems. Intergenerational trauma is when we carry the unhealed wounds, pain, reactions, beliefs, and organizing principles of past generations into our lives, continuing cycles of oppression, inequity, persecution, and deprivation in the present. The cycle continues when we do not make conscious effort to break it, to heal, and project or transmit the same old intergenerational fodder onto our children. Just as trauma travels through relationships, so does healing. Our own healing is the greatest revolution to ensure a kinder, more equitable, and sustainable world. It's in the present where the past can be metabolized and transformed, and the future can be rerouted. So that's my definition. And if you have any sort of reflections or questions on that, or if you have a completely different definition, I encourage you to share it, because this is a collaborative space and must be a collaborative space. This is such a new area for all of our inquiry. Now, while I'm not a scientist or a specialist in the area of science, I'm going to really touch briefly on the topic of epigenetics for those of you who are real left-brainers and love the science. So it really is not my area of specialty. The focus of my work rather is to look at human behavior within dynamics, relationships, families, cultures, systems, commerce, and the changing global context. In essence, epigenetics explores the concept that our genes are influenced both by nature and nurture, which means that the experiences that our parents and grandparents lived through can alter the genetic material or DNA that is passed down to the next generation. This means that if our ancestors lived through trauma, it can be passed down to us. It also means that if we live through healing, we can pass this down too. Our genes, our DNA, our cells are in constant adaptation or evolution. And I believe our task is to reroute us from adaptation to evolution. Now, I'm going to share a little bit about the 3-generation arc of evolution. When we look at the arc of both trauma manifestation and cultural healing and evolution, we can consider looking at a 3-generation arc. Where I bring this concept, again, touches the science, but it's also very philosophical and esoteric, which is my favorite place. When a baby girl is a 4-month-old fetus in her mother's womb, she develops all of the eggs that she will ever have. And during that profoundly creative time in utero, 3 generations intertwine, lives merge, DNA is shared. A grandmother influences the blueprint of both her daughter and all her potential future grandchildren. And so this generational triad is something I have explored for myself as I unpack my own trauma, but also for my clients and the cultures and the organizations that I'm working with. And it's really interesting to look back 2 generations, us being in the middle, and then forward 2 generations. Now that we've established a definition for intergenerational trauma, as well as tapped into the science and the concept of this 3-generational arc, we can start to get curious with inquiry around the influences and experiences of our ancestors. We can also get curious and visionary thinking about the next 2 generations. We look back to our grandparents and we look forward to our grandbabies. What is it like to consider ourselves as a transformative generation, metabolizing the past and recalibrating the blueprint of the future? There's so much power here in our living cells, our living breath, our living nervous systems, our words, our actions, our intentions, and our ability to transmit healing through our relationships, families, communities, cultures, and systems. I'm going to pause here and Viv, check in if there have been any questions so far.
There's been one question so far. So Mohini from LinkedIn is asking, coming all the way from India, she has a question. If a person who is alcoholic can be completely treated by hypnotherapy treatment?
Thank you for the question. I don't think that anybody can truly answer that. Hypnotherapy is a really powerful modality, but in my opinion and my professional opinion as a trained hypnotherapist, I believe that if the alcoholism is connected to unresolved developmental trauma, then it would be likely that there would be other processes that would be helpful to really getting to the root. But I can't answer that question definitively. Thank you for asking it though, and welcome any follow-up questions. Please do continue to share your questions through the chat. Don't be shy. It's the dynamic that we create together where the magic arises. For now, I will continue. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of intergenerational inquiry. Traumatic transfer can occur through a number of dynamic experiences. It's complex. And when I use the term traumatic transfer, I'm talking about the trauma that we or a person or a people receives from another data point. And that could be a person or an experience. So some of the different traumatic transfer dynamics could be from a parent to a child. We could experience it from a parent to a parent. So if we're a child watching abusive or harmful, neglectful behavior between two parents, that can also create a traumatic transfer. We may also experience it through a greater family structure and microculture. And again, it becomes more complex as we move out. We may experience traumatic transfer through racial or religious oppression, inequity, or persecution. We may experience traumatic transfer through economic instability or commercial construct, and we may experience traumatic transfer through the politics and the geopolitics that are happening around us as we move through life. As we begin to unpack how we may be holding intergenerational trauma or transmitting intergenerational trauma, we can consider what conditions and dynamics did my parents or grandparents live through? And I'm going to pose some questions, and I encourage you to reflect for yourself. And what I might do towards the end of this session is have Viv to share these questions in the chat so that if you wish, you can take them away for your own journaling or processing. So some of the questions we can ask is, how were they parented? What was their map for love? What model of relating, care, and authentic expression were they shown? What were the oppressive or harmful dynamics within their family? What battles did they face in terms of gender, race, or socioeconomic difficulties? Did they experience financial insecurity or live through economic downturn or depression? What did they learn about work, career, and success? And how did that impact their well-being and sovereignty? Did they live through any wars, global crisis, or natural disasters? So all of these questions we need to get curious and answer just to truly understand this intergenerational arc and perhaps how we have evolved or adapted. Once we pause to consider what the last two generations lived through and how they were either forced or encouraged to survive, withstand, and prevail, we can begin to illuminate the patterns of social evolution or adaptation, the culture of trauma that has been passed down and decontextualised inside us and around us today. At the same time as we explore this inquiry, we'll also likely tap deeper compassion for our ancestors as well as begin to unlock the wisdom we need to heal. Let's talk a little about how this past trauma manifests now. When we carry intergenerational trauma, we'll tend to have a distorted or tainted perceptive pathways. The way we perceive, express, and relate is altered by the unhealed trauma. And so in a moment, we're going to look really briefly at 5 different experiences or lenses that may show up in us as a manifestation of our own intergenerational trauma, either as this constant lens or recurrent triggers. And for each category, I'll share just a little bit about each, but we could really do an entire hour session just on each one. I'll pause first again and just check, Viv, if there have been any more questions as yet.
Not as yet. We'll keep it rolling in.
Okay, a quiet group tonight. Don't be shy. So let's look at these different lenses or experiences that we might be holding if we have unresolved intergenerational trauma. The first is oppression. So when we have unresolved oppression, the felt sentiment is that I have no choice. I have no agency, and therefore I am disempowered or powerless in the world now. And so if we are walking around sort of with this intergenerational trauma inside us, it really makes it hard for us to find our agency or power and break free from any kind of cycles to begin with. If we project past oppression onto others, the felt dynamic experience is you are my oppressor, you are blocking me, you are stopping me. And when this happens, it can cause real dynamic funk with people around us, and that can be at all layers of relating. A really common trigger that can emerge when we are holding this trauma of oppression is to become really triggered when other people set healthy boundaries or make really reasonable requests. And so it's a really important point of inquiry for us to begin to explore, could I be holding this? And could I be projecting this onto others? The next experience or lens that I want to explore briefly is persecution. And when we are holding on to the trauma of persecution, there'll be a felt sentiment of I'm being blamed or shamed, and it's not my fault. I didn't do anything. Why are you blaming me? And this is a really common trauma trigger for anybody whose ancestors have been marginalized. So for me, it used to be a really big one. So my ancestors lived through World War II. My grandmother kid like Anne Frank, and she escaped from Poland to Australia. And I think that this persecution of a whole people traveled through her to my parents and then to me too. And it's been really interesting processing that fear that speaking up, that being authentic is going to result in some kind of shame, blame, or harm or persecution. Just take a moment to sort of pause with those first two. Do they resonate for you? Have you experienced them? What about in the people in your lives, whether that's your family or your friends or your colleagues at work? Can you start to notice how that experience might be colouring or being projected into places where perhaps the origin is not there? Let's also explore the third point of inequity. So if we are holding unresolved trauma around inequity, the felt sentiment will be, I feel like I'm either not being treated or accommodated fairly or not being seen, either entirely or partially. And this is a really common one for many of us. And when we project this onto others, the common sentiment now is you make me feel othered. And that word othered is a really big one. And often it's coming from, at least in part, our own unresolved intergenerational trauma. And I pause here to kind of make a point that the world we're living in now, the paradigm we're living now, is a pretty traumatized one. And so these same experiences from past generations that we've sort of carried from our ancestors are actually playing out in the present. So in some cases, the trauma may be triggered, but in some cases we are actually being treated without equity in the present. And it can be really confusing to begin to unpack, is my trigger related to what's going on now, or is my trigger related to my trauma? And it can kind of get all tangled up. And I call this experience a hybrid trigger. Often both things are true. And when we're experiencing a hybrid trigger, it can be really, really hard. We can feel confused and maybe even a little bit crazy, like, is this me? Is this them? Why am I feeling this way? And so if you're having a dynamic trigger where you're feeling that, it's a sure sign that there's likely a hybrid trigger to unpack. And it's really helpful to be able to assign the past to the past and the present to the present. And in fact, that is essential for healing trauma. And some of the sort of triggers that come along with the inequity trigger are around miscommunication, generalizations, and sometimes it can even be triggered simply through dissonance or difference or lack of attunement. And what's really interesting is that in all relationships, there will be experience of dissonance and difference and lack of attunement. No one is perfectly attuned to another person all of the time. It's just not really possible. Not even a mother to a baby isn't attuned all the time. And so when we have this trauma around inequity and feeling othered, if it's so, I guess, intense that dissonance or difference or not really being understood in a moment are triggering, it can make relating really hard, and it makes us either feel really unseen and shut down or feel pretty angry that people aren't really understanding us. And so I feel like this is a really important one for us to explore, particularly in the current DEIB paradigm. The fourth experience for us to unpack is around violence. So if we have unresolved trauma around violence, the felt sentiment we might hold is that we're being harmed, either all of the time or intermittently. And this is a really painful way to live. And many of us have lived or do still live that way. And when we project this onto others, the experience is, well, you're harming me. You're a perpetrator. And again, this one is the one that can be really, really difficult to understand if we are currently living in harmful or abusive relationships. But sometimes it happens that that's not the case, but there's still this experience of being harmed, and we end up turning other people into perpetrators. And an example of a couple of triggers that might bring this up are the felt sense of an energetic boundary breach. So somebody getting too close, somebody speaking too loudly, somebody putting a hand on your back when it's unwelcome. These can all trigger unresolved trauma around violence. Another way that it can be triggered is when somebody asks for something that may feel energetically beyond capacity. So if we're holding unresolved trauma around violence, it's really common that when our capacity is exceeded, we will feel that everything and everyone around us is a threat, is harming us. So this one is very, very important for us to explore and understand, not only for ourselves, but if we are engaging with people, whether that's in our personal world or our professional world, that have been through experience of violence, there needs to be a lot of great care around this underlying experience and the potential for triggering, becoming a perpetrator without even knowing it. The last one that I would like to speak briefly about is deprivation. And many of us have gone through experiences, or our ancestors have gone through experiences of deprivation. And the felt sentiment here is there's not enough. I better hunker down, work hard, and build my rations. It's survival time. When we have this kind of deprivation trauma, it can feel like we need to save for a rainy day, ration our food, our energy, and love. And it causes us to live in fear and a state of contraction where we're never fully expressed through our vitality. And interestingly, this kind of trauma is often re-triggered by the climb of the mountain of the commercial construct that we are living in, that encourages us to keep running and working and striving and collecting followers and prizes, and not to pause and to slow down and to feed and nourish ourselves properly. So we deprive ourselves in an attempt to keep gaining. So this modern paradigm actually keeps us in a constant state of deprivation and fear, and it perpetuates cycles of burnout and illness and competition and polarity. We literally create a world of survival of the fittest. And the result is that we walk around feeling oppressed, persecuted, othered, and harmed by each other, and reacting to that. And we're depriving ourselves and each other and reacting to that. And what's become really fascinating to me is that many of our attempts to remedy real life experiences of intergenerational trauma in the present are really being thwarted by this unconscious, complex reaction that spirals inside us and also between us. And I think while we keep projecting our trauma into the present and demanding that others don't trigger us and building relationships, systems, businesses, and communities from a largely reactive and unconscious place, we recreate cycles of oppression, persecution, and othering, harm, and deprivation, all of the things that we're actually trying to heal from. This is the trauma paradox. Maybe it looks a little different this time, but in reality, it's just our trauma dressed up in a different costume. Our attempts to think and force our way out of trauma will never integrate or sustain. I'm going to pause on that sort of very intense note. And Viv, I can see there's a couple of questions coming in.
Yes. So Alita's asking if you could give an example of trauma triggers related to oppression.
Trauma triggers related to oppression are usually around feeling like we're having our choice and agency stripped. So when somebody tells us no, or that's not an option, or you can't, or that's not possible, it can really trigger past trauma around oppression. So in my world and what I teach a relational approach to supporting healing from trauma. So, what is the remedy? Always we want to understand that if the root of the trauma and the pain, the wounds happen in dynamic, the healing can also happen in dynamic. So if we know that somebody has the oppression trauma and that they feel most commonly like their choice and agency aren't available or don't matter, we can be really intelligent and start showing up where possible, offering agency and choice. And it could be as simple as, do you want this or do you want that? Would you like more or would you like less? And so there's these really beautiful, simple ways that we can relate that dynamically transfer that healing. And this concept is the essence of my work, because I believe if we get to a point where we are healed enough and conscious enough and have enough resources and capacity inside us that we're not getting triggered and flying all around with our own unresolved stuff, we can show up and become the resource to repair the relational wounds of the past. And it can be done in these really small little ways. I hope that answers, and let me know if there's a follow-up question. Viv, I'll take a couple more questions if there are any.
Yes, and this is a particularly long question. So, in what way may severe mourning, so for example, caused by sudden death of a mother of a pregnant woman, affect the unborn baby? And also, said differently, can great joy about a young born baby mixed with great mourning about sudden death of a loved one negatively affect the development of a safe bonding of the baby?
Thanks for posing that question. You know, our baby, when they're in our womb, are experiencing most of what we experience, and that's normal. And so I suppose if we are grieving, that's going to be part of their experience too. And if we are feeling joy, that's going to be part of their experience too. I think the beautiful thing is that we will have many, 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 many experiences as a mother or a parent. So while that baby may experience our grief, they will also experience our joy. And I think that we evolve over time, and part of the human experience is to learn that all emotions are welcome. So I don't know that it would actually be harmful. What I believe would be harmful is if the baby, when it was born or in its childhood, was rejected or angered upon due to the grief. But I don't believe that the experience of witnessing a mother's grief or being with a mother's grief while in utero or while in life is harmful. And I think, in fact, it can build beautiful resilience and compassion for the nature of humanity as long as we welcome it and we welcome our child's reflection of it as well. And I think certainly the way I wish to parent, and I guess I'm just one mother, is to be as authentic and honest as possible and to welcome my experience and also welcome my child's, because that is how we learn to be human and complex and vulnerable and learn that even when we experience really difficult things, we're safe with it and we can share it and we're healing. And I believe that these sentiments are something that many of us didn't receive early on and have been lost in our modern world. So thank you for that question, and let me know if there's a follow-up or anybody tuning in. If you have a counterpoint, I'd love to hear it. Are there any other questions right now, Viv?
Yeah, they're flowing in. So another one on baby, how do hidden pregnancies, so for example, back when it was frowned upon to have a child out of wedlock, have an impact on the baby as an adult?
Again, I think it's really complex and there's no one size fits all answer. So we want to remember that trauma is not the past experience itself. It's the way that it's left unmetabolized inside us and goes on to create changes in the way we perceive, express, and relate. So two babies or children could live through the exact same thing, and one of them could end up pretty traumatized and one of them could end up pretty fine. And this depends on a number of factors. One is our physical health at the time of and after the trauma. One is our mental health at the time of and after the trauma. One is our environment at the time of and after the trauma. And the most important one is our relationships at the time of or after the trauma. So if we are able to share our difficult experiences with someone that we feel very safe with, very often it doesn't go on to become trauma, or perhaps it lessens the intensity or complexity or severity of the trauma. So our ability to be received through painful or overwhelming experiences increases our capacity to go on and metabolize them. Now, because this question is largely around babies, when we are in utero, when we're babies or pre-verbal, it's really not possible for us to, in the present, have that experience where we can share how we're feeling and be responded to. And so something that I have worked with quite a bit as a therapist is working with both women and men who have gone through some kind of developmental trauma, either as babies or in their pre-verbal years. And it is showing up in their lives, but it's showing up in code. So sometimes it shows up as illness. Sometimes it shows up as really, really needing a lot of attention and a lot of physical attention. And sometimes it shows up as this nameless, strange anxiety of being alone. So the trauma can manifest in all of these ways that are coded. And our job when it comes to healing is to sort of explore the story. What happened, what was relationally lacking or what was relationally harmful, and how does it link into the greater architecture or tapestry of what we're experiencing now? And then again, we want to get really intelligent and understand, well, how can we relationally or dynamically begin to repair? So when it comes to this kind of birth trauma or newborn or baby trauma, often touch is one of the most profound ways to work with it. And that's what people come to see me for, because you're actually engaging in that nonverbal realm. And so often the trauma is trapped in the somatic unconscious realms of a body. And so therefore the route to healing is very similar to where the wound was or the way that it manifested or adapted. I hope that's helpful. This is a very, very specific niche topic that, again, we could have months of conversation on, but thank you for bringing it. Viv, are there any more questions right now?
Yeah, quite a few more. So one is, what are your thoughts on professionals, so like medical and psychiatrists sharing their own experiences slash trauma?
Do you mean in a session or just generally in the world? Maybe you could clarify. I think, pardon?
Sounds general, but yeah, I hope she can clarify.
Yeah, I think that it's so important when it comes to just being human, that therapists and coaches and helping professionals are able to show up and speak of their pain or their wounds too, not necessarily in a session, but it's part of being human, and normalizing ourselves and getting down off pedestals and rejoining humanity. Most people who are in helping professions have gone through something themselves. It's what inspired us to go there. And what can happen if we all be very quiet about it is that clients put us on a pedestal in this unattainable position, and also we be quiet and stop being authentic about what we've lived through, and it makes it really hard for us to feel human and connected and receive the care and support we need. Having said that, when it comes to sharing personal information in a session, I think it's a very delicate boundary that depends on the type of professional and what may be appropriate. I know for myself, my client sessions are about them and we're processing them. But of course, in a public forum here and through my book and some of the other programs that I teach, I am more open-minded. So I think that it's a very textured topic where there's no real clear answer. But I hope that that helps. And if there's a follow-up question, let me know. Viv, I'll take 2 more questions and then maybe we'll move on a little.
So one more question is, could or can an adult child try to make the parent aware of their parent's trauma?
This all depends on receptivity. So we can never get anybody to be available to hear or digest something that they really don't want to or don't have the capacity to hear. We can always try, we can always plant a seed. So again, a lot of what's coming through in this session is that, gosh, this is such a complex topic and it's so unique and individual for each one of us and for each dynamic that we're in. So we may have a parent that's really ready and willing to sit down and listen to us and explore the story. We may even have a parent that is willing to take accountability for some of the things that they've passed down to us. We may also have a parent that just doesn't want to talk to us. We may also have a parent that doesn't have the capacity and may start yelling and shaming and blaming and repeating a cycle if we even try and go anywhere near it. So we always have to meet people where we are. And it's pretty beautiful if we are able to have conversations with our parents or family members or other people who have, I guess, starred in our own trauma story. But when they're not available, it can be really painful. But I think it's important to know that our healing is our healing. Our healing is our own. It's not about making somebody see or understand. And in fact, that can be one of the ways that our trauma shows up and manifests, is this intense desire to make people see. And if only they could just see, it would all be better and everything would be wonderful. And it's something for us to watch. And when we set a boundary with ourselves and stop trying to make people see differently and take accountability or treat us differently, what often happens is that we meet very deep grief and sometimes anger, which is our trauma processing, the fact that perhaps someone did hurt us or did neglect us or wasn't available to us. And so I always believe when we set boundaries with ourselves and the way we tend to play out these trauma patterns, that's where all our content begins to emerge. So if we can learn to put these boundaries in place, all of the healing will happen for ourselves. And when we put them in place around others, what's really common is that people begin to stabilize within their own, I guess, field of experience and maybe be able to begin to see. So I always say, rather than try and get somebody where you want them to be, the best thing for us to do is to focus on our own healing and embodiment and be an example of what it is like to do this healing work. Thank you for the question. Viv, I'll take one more, please.
Yep. And there's one more question about, can you tell me more about trauma and personal boundaries? So I think kind of linked.
I think I probably need a little bit more information to answer clearly, but I can sort of say that when we do have certain types of unresolved trauma, we often completely lack boundaries. So either they're non-existent, and so we allow people to harm us or shame us or persecute us, and we don't really understand boundaries. Or on the flip side, we may become very defensive. So we think we have boundaries, but we're actually building walls between us and others to protect ourselves. So I often say all healing work comes back to boundaries, and it's either about learning to create and resurrect our unexpressed boundaries, or it's about learning to bring down the defenses that we've mistakenly labeled as boundaries as it feels safe. And it's through this inquiry around boundaries that we actually learn to both belong and individuate. So I write a little bit about this in my last book, and I'm writing a lot about it in my second book. If we want to feel like all is well in this collective human world that we're living in, we need to be able to experience both belonging, connectedness, and individuation. And I think many of us have learned that we have to forego one for the other. And when we start working with boundaries, we learn to show up and say, well, this is me and this is you. Where are the points for collaboration? And where are we separate and independent? And one of the terms used for this sort of in the modern psychology paradigm is interdependence. So that's meaning we learn to collaborate together without losing ourselves. So boundaries is a really big one. And it can be really confronting. So it's really common if we've never had boundaries and we start to put them in place, we may feel really big amounts of fear. And that might be perhaps in the past, if we had tried to set a boundary, something bad would have happened. Maybe we would be persecuted or harmed or deprived of something. The other thing that can happen is that we feel shame. So if we've been taught that it's bad to set boundaries and we won't be loved if we set boundaries and look after ourselves, when we start setting them, we might feel a huge sense of shame rising up. And I know in my journey, both of these things were such somatic, physical experiences. And healing asks us to lean into it and to metabolize those old experiences of shame and fear, which again, I write about as blocker emotions. So when we sort of sit with and metabolize these two emotions, which we typically run from, it's when the deeper traumatic content will come up. So we're protecting ourselves from feeling pain in the present or the pain of the past. Thank you for that. I'm going to go on a little, but please do keep the questions coming. They're really beautiful, important, and very varied. So thank you. So all of this intergenerational trauma that we're holding and we're perpetuating really make our world not a great place to live in. So our attempts to force and think our way out of trauma never integrate or sustain. They just create some new mess or difficulty or discord in the world. So some of the ways that we are seeing this now are the rise of the mental health crisis, more and more cases of burnout and autoimmune conditions, illness, the downturn of economy, the ineffectiveness of mental health and DEI initiatives in the workplace, the rising rage and the demand for freedom, the overuse of our Earth's resources, the spilling of our pain through social media, all of this is trauma decontextualized. So how do we heal? That's the big question, isn't it? Intergenerational trauma is not a cognitive experience. So we can't simply think our way out of it. It's a complex, multidimensional experience that lives and breathes in our cells and in the space between us in dynamic. It's beyond rational thought, and it can't be condemned to the coldness of science or politics. Healing happens when we not only honor the pain and the organizing principles we're holding from our ancestors, but when we also honor the incredible wisdom that they carry. We've become so clinical and commercial and calculating in the way that we're dealing with the world and ourselves and our health and our mental health and our relationships that we have forgotten all the ways that we used to heal. It was always in community, in relationship, and it began with sacred intentions. When we look back through most lineages of healing wisdom, we'll find a number of things. We will see communal gathering. We will see invocation and trance. We will see ritual, symbolism, and art. We will see words, mantra, breath, and sound. We will see rhythm, movement, and dance. We'll see the power of touch, healing hands, and we'll see the power of nature, both as sanctuary and medicine. There was no corporate training, list of safe words, pill to pop, or list of self-help books and biohacks. That's not how we did it. There was simply reverence around our life force, our natural order, trust in the healing properties of the body, and the incredible power of relationships and community. If we really want to heal, we need to remember these sacred ingredients and gently find a way to infuse the wisdom of our ancestors into our modern world ways. This is about integrating the past into the present. This is about remembering and slowly, slowly reconnecting to our innate ability to heal. We've never lost it. Our human intelligence has simply been buried beneath our trauma and the dense construct of our modern, commercially driven world. Unearthing this intelligence has been and continues to be my life's work, initially for my own healing, and now through the way I show up to support others, whether that's through therapy, group process, or art, my words. And so I invite you to consider these aspects of healing, the wisdom that I speak of, and perhaps Viv or Marianne, you could put that little list into the chat. And are you tapping any of these now? Likely many of you joining this session will be either consciously or unconsciously tapping into some of these things, and some of them may even be appearing, in different ways in the modalities that you are using to support others. And I think it's a really beautiful inquiry, like how can we gently weave this wisdom in? We don't have to get crazy about it. We're not going to dump away the current paradigm and move back to the old, but it's about this merging, this integration. And integration is important for healing trauma. It's important for being able to move on and evolve to the next phase in ways that are sustainable. When there's mess and when there's lag and when there's bridging across worlds, it's really hard for us to evolve and things get more and more complex. So just as we want to integrate our past wounds, we also want to integrate our past wisdom. And what does that look like in your world, whether that's your personal world or whether that's your relational or professional world? So I leave you with that inquiry. In a minute, I'll share a little bit more about the ways I weave this into my work. But I'll pause again now, Viv, and see if there are a couple more questions before we begin to wrap up today's session.
Yeah. So I think one common question: do you think trauma is ever healed, or is your view what trauma is managed?
This is the most asked question, and maybe Marianne will ask you to go and find the link to the article, which we should probably just put as a common thing to share. So the question I get asked the most is, do we ever really heal from trauma? And I don't believe in a healed state. I think believing in a healed state keeps us in that climbing up the mountain, got to get there, got to go, got to keep going mentality, which is actually what perpetuates that cycle of burnout and speed and going and never being satisfied. And, I have seen people like this on their healing journey, like, I've just got to do this modality and this thing, and then I've got to get there and I've got to keep healing. And that's not healing, that's pushing and forcing and striving. And I think if we can sort of shift the way we're thinking about healing from a place to get to more of a way of life, that can be really, really helpful. How can we learn to heal in real time? We go through things all of the time. I also think it can be helpful to look for markers on our healing journey to aspire to. So one of the first ones would be a greater sense of internal safety and relational safety and relational harmony. So when we start to feel I'm safe inside my body and I'm safe in the world and I feel safer in relationships, and oh, look, I can get along and it's nice, that is a huge marker of healing. Another marker is increased capacity for experience. So when we increase our capacity for experience, the word that's most typically used here is resilience, but it basically means that we can take in more of the world, we have more aliveness. So we may be able to feel greater joy, but we will also be able to sit with greater pain without feeling like we're in the black hole and we're never going to get out. So that's a really good marker as well. Another good marker is allowing ourselves to be complex. So when we have trauma, we tend to put ourselves in box and polarize ourselves. I can be this or that, but I can't be this and that. And so another marker of healing is being, oh, okay, I'm this and I'm this too, and that's okay. And one more marker that I'll share, though there are many, is being able to meet ourselves with deep compassion. So those of us that have unresolved trauma are often holding a lot of judgment or even self-hatred. And we're pretty awful to ourselves. And so being able to meet ourselves very compassionately when we've had a bad day or when we've slipped up or made a mistake or not done as well as we like, that is a huge marker. And I think that one can take a really long time to get there, because many of us have these mean bitches living inside our heads, excuse my language, that like to shame us and smack talk us. And so we may not be fully able to externalize them. Maybe we can, but at least if we can understand them and set a boundary and begin to be far more compassionate with ourselves. And for those of you that topic resonates with, there's a chapter in my book called The Inherited Voice. So I believe that shaming voice inside us is actually our intergenerational trauma internalized. So all of these forces and all those different layers of traumatic transfer that I shared earlier, they often become an amalgamated voice. It's the voice of shame. It's the voice of get back in your box. It's the voice of you don't deserve. It's the voice of you horrible person. And I believe a really big part of healing is learning to notice it, and to begin the process of externalizing it. But it begins with setting boundaries again and again and again. It's a really hard one. Viv, I'll take 2 more questions if there are any.
Yeah, so one of it is, does grief from 25 years of unconscious and trauma ever stop or reduce?
I believe it does. So to me, grief is a fundamental experience of life. I grieve every week. When I was in my early stages of trauma and I started to tap my grief after having it buried, for decades, it felt like a tap that would never turn off, or a pool I would drown in. And so it's really common that when we begin to touch it, it can feel like, oh my goodness, I'm going to fall in and never get out. But I believe that it does begin to clear. And then the grieving that we do again becomes the daily grieving of life. So to me, grief is a fundamental experience connected to change. So whenever something is changing, whenever we're losing something or saying goodbye to something or moving on, there's a necessity to grieve. And healthy grief transcends the arc from loss to desire. So when we grieve what we have lost or what we are going to lose or worried to lose, we also, if we travel the arc, connect to the things that we desire and that we wish to create. So grief is this really beautiful, transformative energy. When we are holding on to the grief of trauma, it's very common that we are stuck in the loss piece and we're not able to travel the arc. But as we let go and let go and let go, we start to begin to move and to travel. But it has no timeline, and it often happens in waves. I hope that answers, and let me know if there's a follow-up. I'll take one more question, please, Viv.
Yeah, so will you be able to suggest a best way to overcome from mental trauma and traumatic mood swings in a female caused by surrounding people and situations?
Again, I think that's such a difficult question to answer because I would need to know so much information. I think there is no one strategy for healing from trauma. And it again comes back to this need for a relational approach and a compassionate approach. So we can't heal trauma with one modality or guidebook. What we need to do is tune in and create a safe space for that person to have their experience and to move through it. And that can take a really long time. The more we understand about, grief is often about lack, what was lacking, we can see if we're able to offer what was lacking through dynamic. But this becomes a bigger inquiry for us as to what is our role? What is our role to support someone? And where is the boundary around our role? And this, again, is something that we explore deeply in all of my programs, because it's important that we give what is appropriate within any dynamic we have. So something that we can have as a tendency of a wounded healer, which probably many of us on today's call have this archetype within us, is that we just want to make it better and we really want to help and we want to heal the pain of the world. But without those really important boundaries and intentions, what can happen is that we fall into our own depletion or burnout, or we project our pain onto others. And so part of our job is to pull back and to learn, well, what is my place here? What is my role here? And how can I show up in small and meaningful ways within that? How can I tap my intelligence and share it while remaining healthy? I'll take one more question, Viv, please.
Well, we've got kind of almost administrative questions that are related. So, do you have any visuals of what you have shared today? And do they get a recording?
Oh, there'll be a recording. So if you are live or if you registered but weren't able to turn up, you will receive the recording. I don't have any visuals to share today, but I believe that my team has put some of the points that we've been exploring into the chat. Thank you so much, everybody who's joined and shared your time and your energy and your questions and thoughts. I really appreciate it. I think that this conversation is so important and needs to be ongoing. For those of you that are interested to continue the conversation, I hope that you will continue to show up to these lives, check out all of my articles online, and consider joining me in the journey of human intelligence, where we begin to explore how is this showing up in us, and how can we show up as the humans that heal with this intelligence, and how can we infuse the wisdom of our ancestors into the way that we do it. So I've just finished up teaching here in Singapore 2 really powerful modules plus Train the Trainer, which has been fabulous to now have more amazing humans taking this work into the world. And I'm about to travel to Austin and New York to deliver, and then also on to Amsterdam as well. The next in-person trainings are going to happen in Asia. We're still deciding whether we're going to do it in Singapore again or try out being more retreat style in Bali. And so we'll have modules 1, 2, and 3. And so if you're interested, you can hop online and check that out. And I also am launching in January for the first time module 1 online. And so instead of a 3-day immersion, it's actually going to be a 3-month process with 6 live sessions and also some online learning. And I know many of you have been asking for it for a couple of years now, and I'm finally ready. And so I look forward to, if you're not able to make an in-person immersion, to seeing you as part of the online global cohort that starts in January, and my team's sharing some links there as well. Thank you so very much. I'm really grateful for your time, your energy, your attention. And I'll look forward to seeing you, if not in person, online and through the screen very soon. Good night.